and we perfectly know who he is. So what can I tell you about Professor King that you don't know? I could say, for instance, that Gary teaches at Harvard since 1987, or that Gary King is one of the 25 university professors at Harvard, and that he occupies the chair that before was occupied by Samuel Huntington, whom we also have read extensively. Or I could also say that he's probably the most cited author of his cohort in political science. Or I could say that he's the director of the Institute of Quantitative Social Science Research at Harvard, which is an institute that provides methodological assistance to the University of Harvard, but also consults all over the world on problems with social sciences and basically comes up with solutions to problems in public policies. But this would be some sort to miss the point, the key variable to explain the model of Gary's success. And in my personal opinion, the key variable to the model to understand Gary's success is that Gary is a unique and a wonderful professor, and that he teaches with passion, and that he has this unique art of making you feel like you understand something that you actually think you're unable to understand, because this sophistication in the methods that Gary teaches in his courses on advanced quantitative methods are really hard to grasp. So you try to grasp them, but when you listen to Gary, you get the impression that you do understand until you go home and you try to replicate it, and then you actually understand that you don't get the same results. And you ask yourself, why didn't I get the same result? So you discuss it, and then that's the point that Gary wants to make. Replicate. There's a beautiful piece that he published that you can read, and where he explains why it is important to replicate and to get wrong results, because that makes you think about why results can be right or wrong, and what you have to do to get them right. So this is the point that I wanted to stress, and just quickly on behalf of the Mexican Association of Political Science, I wanted to thank Gary to have accepted our invitation, and I wanted you to welcome him here with me in Mexico.
Thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. What a beautiful place you have here. I thought I would start by talking about why I'm studying Chinese social media, because my Chinese is not as good as my Spanish. So the reason why is we actually didn't intend to study China. My two graduate students and I, Jen Pan, who's now an assistant professor at Stanford, and Molly Roberts, who's an assistant professor at UCSD. We didn't intend to study China. We were studying automated text analysis. There's 750 million social media posts a year published internationally, and we developed some methods that enable human beings to try to understand what millions of people are saying. You can't possibly read it by hand. You can only do it by computer. So we were trying to improve these methods, and we thought, let's see if we can take this method and push it until it breaks. And when it breaks, we would then understand something more about it, and we could improve it. So we thought, let's try this in Chinese. Chinese works completely differently. I don't even know Chinese. Jen and Molly happen to speak Chinese. And so let's try it. So there's a company, a firm, called Crimson Hexagon that I actually founded. And they go around the world and they collect all social media posts that are public. And then they use some of the methods that we've previously come up with to analyze them, and they sell like brand monitoring to big companies, and to governments and to nonprofits. And so we went to Crimson Hexagon, we downloaded some of their Chinese language social media posts, and we were analyzing them and seeing whether it worked, and we were pushing forward things until they broke. And then I thought, let's try the qualitative approach here. And click on, so when we get the data from Crimson Hexagon, it has the text of the post, and it also has the URL, you know, the web address. And so I said to Jen and Molly, click on some of those URLs, go back to the website from which they came, and just try to understand the context in which the posts exist, right? The deep qualitative context in which people write these things. And they came back to my office and they said, there's something wrong with the data from Crimson Hexagon. Because sometimes we click on the posts and it goes back to the website just as you would expect. Looks like a Chinese version of Facebook. Then other times you click and nothing happens. So I said, show me. And we walk over to the computer in my office and we're clicking on individual posts. And sometimes you see the first, and sometimes you see the second. So sometimes you see the Chinese version of Facebook, and sometimes it just waits. You know, like that happens on the web all the time, right, where it doesn't go through. And then we're clicking and clicking, and one post said, this post is being investigated. We clicked on the URL from which a social media post was. When we clicked on it, we went back to that post and it said, this post is being investigated. And I said, who investigates social media posts? Right? Why would anybody investigate a social media post? And then, of course, the Chinese government would. The Chinese government is not embarrassed about censorship. They read all of the social media posts that appear on the web, and within a few hours, they take the ones down they don't like. And, more surprisingly, we had the ability to download all Chinese language social media posts before the Chinese government could read and censor them. We had the entire corpus of censored Chinese language posts that the Chinese people could not read because they were not allowed to, but we could. And so we thought, let's forget that paper on automated text analysis we were going to write, right? And instead, let's work on this project. And so we designed a network of computers around the world to go back to the website from which they came to see if the posts were still up. And we wrote our first papers. This paper is about something different, but I'll summarize the first ones as well. So the first paper that I described is this one. It appeared in the American Political Science Review a few years ago. Then we wrote another one in which we ran a randomized experiment and wrote social media posts and randomized them to support the government and oppose the government and about collective action, etc. And that's called, and that appeared in Science. And then this is the paper I'm going to describe today, where the Chinese government fabricates news. They fabricate 450 million social media posts. They write them by hand, 450 million, and they post them in the name of other people, of ordinary people. You follow me? That's surprising, right? Okay. You should feel free to interrupt me if you want. Okay. Okay, so, and those are the three papers. The third one is the main one that I'm going to talk about. And then here's the methods papers that I actually was focusing on that we were intending to write, but I'm not going to talk about them today. Okay. So, for starters, everybody knows the goal of censorship. So censorship is when posts are taken off the web. So what's the goal? The goal is to stop criticism and protest and collective action about the state, the leaders, and their policies. Everybody knows this. And so when we finally had the first data set, the first large-scale data set on censorship, where every post was labeled as either censored or uncensored, we then tested this obvious hypothesis. And what did we learn? We learned it was utterly and completely wrong. Okay? It was not true that this is how people censor. So I want you to know, I put this jacket on for you. Okay? So now that we have that respect part over, I'm going to take it off. Okay, so this obvious point, it just wasn't right. So we looked at the data, and we looked at it through different lenses, and we tried to figure out, well, what was it that was causing censorship? And do you know how people say it's the end of theory because now we have big data and we can figure out everything from the data? That's nuts. It's just crazy. Because we had all the data. We had millions of posts. Some were censored, some were not censored. And there was no way for us to figure out what the rules were. I mean, we looked at the existing theories about the rules, and none of them made any sense. None of them distinguished the posts that were censored from the posts that were not censored. We looked at it in every way we could. And then finally, we asked ourselves, what could be, well, we asked ourselves a lot of times, what could be the goal? And we finally looked at it through a different lens. We said, let's separate out two things. Let's separate out where the goal of censorship is to stop criticism of the state, or maybe it's just to stop collective action, to stop protest, to stop gathering. So if you look at it that way, and you ask the question, is the first category censored, or is the second category censored? It turns out that the first one is wrong and the second one is right. So let me explain that. In China, you can write a social media post that says, the leaders of this town are all stealing money. Here's how much. They have the money stashed in overseas bank accounts. Here's where they are. And by the way, they all have mistresses, and here are their names. And that won't be censored. Okay? But if you say also, and let's go protest, that will be censored. Okay? In fact, if you say, the leaders of this town are doing such a great job, we really like what they're doing, let's have a big rally in their favor, that will be censored. They don't care what you think of them. They are a bunch of dictators. What should you think of them? Right? They only care what you can do. And if you have the ability to move people, if you have the ability to control some power by being able to move people, then they'll stop you. Okay. So that's what we discovered. The first one was wrong and the second one was right. The implications here is that social media is actionable. It's actionable for the Chinese leaders, and it's actionable for us as researchers. For the Chinese leaders, they not only allow criticism, but they measure it. Okay? So why do they measure it? They measure it to judge local leaders. So imagine you were running all of China. You have more power than the richest person in the world and the leaders of all the democracies combined. You have a good thing going, right? What is it that you want? You want? You want to keep a good thing going, right? You don't want it to stop. That's what you want. How do you do that? Well, there's 700,000 towns and cities across China. So you have to appoint 700,000 of your closest friends to watch them, right? How do you do that? That's pretty hard. And then what do? Well, they all start stealing money in different ways. And if one of them starts stealing too much, then the people in that town might rise up and protest. And that protest might spread contagiously across the country, and you might lose your job. So you don't want that to happen. So you have to find the people, the leaders of the local towns who are not doing a good job. Before the protest happens, how do you do that? How do you find that out? Well, you could do 700,000 public opinion polls, but that doesn't seem feasible. Instead, you can monitor the local officials in social media, and you can see who's being criticized. And when one of the leaders is being criticized a lot, you just replace them. You just take them out and do whatever the Chinese government does with them, and replace them with somebody else. And in fact, that's what they do. And then, if there's collective action, if there's protest, they stop it. They censor that as fast as they can. So it turns out that as researchers, we can use this information and have used this information. Because we know now the intentions of the leaders, so we can then predict what they're going to do before they do it. So we can predict and we can see visibly which local officials are in trouble and likely to be replaced. We know which ones are going to be replaced maybe even before they know, but certainly before any other researchers know. We can visibly see which policies are generating dissent in the interest of the leaders. We can predict government action outside the internet. We have predicted which dissidents are going to be arrested before they're arrested, which peace treaties are going to be signed before they're signed, and emerging scandals. Even if we don't know what the scandal is, we know something's up. And we can also see disagreements between central leaders and local leaders. The general idea of this project is that if you look at things at scale, you can see things very differently. It's like, I mean, there's a big, the Chinese propaganda apparatus is like a big elephant tiptoeing around, trying not to get in, not to be seen, but it's a giant elephant, right? And what we see is that if you look at it at scale, and only at scale, in our case with millions of social media posts, then you notice that big elephants tiptoeing around leave big footprints. And so those footprints are very valuable for research. And so we can see things that couldn't have been seen otherwise. So to give you a feel for it, this is a graph of censorship. Where's my little thing here? Yeah, so on the horizontal axis, this is time. This is just a simple example of a sample of posts, where the vertical axis is a count of how many posts, and this is the volume. This particular graph is one of many, which is about Ai Weiwei, who was a dissident in China. Do you remember the last Winter Olympics in China? And there was a stadium that looked like a bird's nest. Do you remember this? Looks like a bird's nest, right? So that was created, designed by this guy, Ai Weiwei. And he, after the Olympics, started tweeting about the Jasmine Spring, which is like the Arab Spring, but for China. So he became a dissident. He had the ability to move people. And the government knows that he has the ability to move people. So whenever people on the web are talking about him in a big spike of activity, like this gray bar, they censor it. So the red here is censored, the gray is just volume. And so you see what happened is, there's a big spike of activity when he was arrested. No surprise. And then the Chinese government followed this spike up, they followed it up the hill and took it all down. So if you were watching on the web, you wouldn't have any idea that there were a lot of people objecting to Ai Weiwei. There were to Ai Weiwei being arrested, and you would have no idea that he was basically calling for protest. That all information about the protest basically disappeared. Here's another case. I like this one even better. We were monitoring the environment. So these are posts about the environment. Then here there's a big spike. This big spike is in one town in China. There was an environmental lottery. So a lottery where you put in a peso or a dollar or whatever it is, and if you win, then you win a whole lot of money, right? But the government of this town said, let's have a lottery where the proceeds of the lottery goes to the environment. And people loved this idea. They thought this is a great idea because there's a lot of pollution in China. We want to help the environment. So this town really liked the leaders' decisions. So what did they do? They had a big rally in favor of the leaders. That's what this is. This is a big spike of discussion on the web and saying, hey, we're going to have a rally in favor of these great guys that did this terrific thing of having this environmental lottery. Let's go and thank them. What happened? They censored all of those posts. They don't care that everybody was in favor of them. They care that they had the ability to move people. Do you follow? Okay. Yeah. So here's an example of, we were following discussion of the one-child policy, which now is a two-child policy, but you can only have one child. Can you think of a more controversial policy? Right? Policies about sex or kids, that's really controversial. There were spikes of activity on the web, but there was no protest on the ground. There was no real protest, so the Chinese government didn't censor any of it. Or electricity prices. We have plenty of protests about electricity prices in the US, but there was no protest on the ground, so they didn't censor any of it. Okay. Okay, let me switch gears. So I'm going to talk now about fabricating posts instead of taking down posts, instead of censoring posts. Okay. It's still control of information, but just in a different way. Okay. So the Chinese 50-cent party, that's what it's called. It's called a 50-cent party. They don't really have political parties in China. There's no electoral competition or anything like that. But they have a 50-cent party. So the 50-cent party are people rumored to write social media posts for 50 cents a piece, like a few pennies, and post them on the web in the name of other people. So that's called the 50-cent party. It's the name everyone uses. Some people think it's pejorative, but that's the popular name. There's been no evidence of this at all, but everybody believes it happens. I'm going to show you the first evidence of it. So the prevailing view of what these people are doing, of scholars, of activists that don't like what the Chinese government's doing, of journalists who write about it, and of people in social media that accuse other people of being members of the 50-cent party because of what they wrote, everybody thinks the same thing. What they all think is that the 50-cent party argues with and debates against those who criticize the government, its leaders, and their policies. Okay? It's just, if you argue against the government, if you say something bad about the government, the idea is the 50-cent party jumps in and argues against you. Right? You follow? Okay, so that's the argument. By the way, in the US, in about 3rd grade, people take a spelling class. They try to spell English language words. And they're very often given the longest English language word, which it turns out an American 3rd grader or a 3rd grader can spell because it's sound out. Does anybody know that word? The longest English language word. Have you ever heard this? Okay, so it's anti-disestablishmentarianism. That's the longest English language word. That word means against the people who are against the government. I got to use that word in a paper for the first time. It's in the American Political Science Review. I've never seen it used since 3rd grade. Okay, so what's the evidence that all of this is anti-disestablishmentarianism? What's the evidence that people are arguing against people who argue against the government? The evidence is none, basically. There's a few anecdotes from journalists. The quotes from the academic literature are, there's no ground truth. There are no successful attempts to quantify 50-cent party activity. There are even several analyses where people make up the variable they're trying to explain. They literally make it up on the basis of plausible rules, and then they spend the rest of the article trying to explain the variable that they just made up. Right? It's not very useful scholarship. But it's the best you can do when you have no data. And there's been no data about this supposedly large operation. Okay. We discovered, I should have built that up, but we discovered when we figured out what this operation was, that the existing explanation, the existing theory of what the 50-cent party was doing was completely wrong. Okay? We thought that this was true also, but it's not right. Okay, so what is it that they are doing? Okay. Turns out, since it's not a mystery story, I'll give you the answer and then I'll explain to you how we got to it. So it turns out the 50-cent party does not argue with anybody. They do not engage on controversial issues at all. They write millions of posts and post them in the name of other people, but they don't argue with anybody. What do? They distract. They redirect public attention from criticism and central issues to cheerleading and positive discussions about other issues. They'll write posts like, I woke up this morning and I noticed that it's a beautiful day today. Right? This is a Chinese government activity. They'll say, today I've been thinking about how important our martyrs were to the history of China. fluff, right? Or, you know, there's a new holiday today, stuff like that. And they write millions of these things. And you think about, why in the world do they do this, okay? Well, think of the last time you personally had a big fight with your spouse, or your kids, or your parents, or someone else, okay? And you wanted to end the fight. You wanted to stop the argument. So option one, you're all great academics, is to use the best academic counter-argument that you could come up with. How often did that work?
Terribly bad.
Right?
Terribly bad.
That's right. Option two is to say, hey, let's go get ice cream. Right? A lot of people tell me that's their central parenting strategy. It certainly was mine. Right? And it is what the Chinese government's doing. Okay? They're changing the subject. They're flooding the web at particular moments when there's collective action, when they're worried about collective action, when people are talking about it. They flood the web with this distraction. And if you wanted to follow the discussion about the protest that was going to happen, it's hard to find the posts about that because it's filled with all this other stuff, right? So it's a giant cannon that's fired when they need it. That's basically the story. So let me show you how we figured this out. It's the first systematic evidence of China's 50 Cent Party. First thing we did is we found a leaked archive. They were not leaked to us. They were on the web. In one county, there was a leaked archive of emails to the propaganda office. It had been reported in the media, on the web, but mostly ignored. It was workers claiming credit for writing 50-cent posts. That's interesting, we thought. But it's large, it's unstructured, it's messy data, it's really hard to deal with. And so we systematized it. We developed some methods to figure out how to do that. We found more than 2,000 emails covering 2013 and 2014. About half of the emails contained the first known examples of real 50-cent posts. We found 43,797 known 50-cent posts, which increases the number of known 50-cent posts in the world by exactly 43,797, because nobody had any examples before. We then mapped patterns of 50-cent workers, because the people in this one county, we had their pictures, we had their telephone numbers, we had their email addresses, we know where they worked, we know everything about them. We know what they wrote, where they wrote it, why they wrote it, for what purpose, where they posted it, when they posted it, where they were when they were posting it. We knew everything about them. So we developed methods to find and systematize those patterns in this one county. We then took this pattern and extrapolated to the rest of China in order to find the people that had not had any emails leaked that were 50-cent party workers in the rest of China, right? In all the other 3,000 counties. We built this model based upon patterns in this one county, and then applied it to the rest of China. Outside of Jianggang is the name of this one county that we had the data from. Okay, but that's an extrapolation. So how are you supposed to know that our extrapolation was right? Okay. So what we did is we validated our prediction, and then we validated the validation of our prediction. Okay. We did a survey. We did a ridiculous survey where we asked people that we predicted to be fabricating social media posts, making them up, and hiding that fact from the public. We did a survey and we asked them whether that's what they were doing. And we got them to say yes. Okay? I'll explain. It's ridiculous. But then, that's not the most outrageous part. The most outrageous part is that we inadvertently, unintentionally, got the Chinese government to admit to everything that they were doing. Okay? I'll explain how that works. Okay. So let's start off with what's going on in this one county, and then I'll explain how we extrapolate. So this is just a little description of all the emails. So that at the middle of this nice little flower is the county propaganda office. And these 200 offices, each one of these is an office that's sending an email to the propaganda office reporting on their 50-cent party activity. And then from the propaganda office, they send mail up the chain of command to higher levels of government. And that's what these are. So what did we learn just from these emails? Well, first of all, who is posting? The rumor was that it was ordinary Chinese people paid 50 cents to write 50-cent posts. That's the prevailing view. But what we found was 99% of the posts were made by government workers in these 200 offices. So it's not true that it's just people paid 50 cents. Nobody was paid 50 cents. They probably weren't paid anything. It's probably just part of the job of ordinary government workers. And it's no surprise. If you wanted to write 450 million social media posts, how would you direct an army of people to do that and do it accurately? Much better to take the people that are already working for you. So I think that makes sense. Okay, so in order to analyze this, I just need to tell you about one thing, which is sorry, I need both hands. There's 5 categories into which we can put these posts in order to be able to understand what the posts are about. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you what the 5 posts are. So 2 of them are what this anti-disestablishmentarianism thing. It's arguing with people who argue with the government, taunting foreign countries or people who support foreign countries which might argue against the government, or literally argumentative praise or criticism about the government. Then there's other things, non-argumentative praise or suggestions, factual reporting, or just cheerleading. What everybody thought is that all of the 50-cent posts were about the first 2 categories, but we find they're mostly about the last 3, and almost all are really about cheerleading. Almost all are about just fluff. Okay. So those are the categories, and I'm going to take all the posts now and I'm going to put them into the categories. I'm going to do 5 separate analyses, not one for each category, but 5 separate analyses, where I'm going to start just with those 43,000 posts in this one county, and I'm going to do an analysis there by taking those 43,000 posts, put them into the 5 categories, and show you that most of those are not arguing, they are just cheerleading. And then we're going to go another step, and we're going to go to not all the posts, but just the Weibo posts, which is sort of like Twitter, because it's easier for us to find those. Then we're going to go another step, and we're going to divide the Weibo posts into 2 categories, one that is easy to extrapolate and another that's not, and they're going to be called ordinary and exclusive accounts. If they post the same kinds of information, then we can use the easier one. It's going to turn out that they do. That's great. Then we're going to go another step. So the next step is to unleaked post from this one county that we didn't get to see because they weren't in the archive, and then we go to the posts all across China. So in 5 steps, in one graph, I'm going to show you all of this. Okay. Here's the graph. This is a histogram of the proportion. The vertical axis is the proportion of posts. The horizontal axis is each of these 5 categories. And as you can see, what everybody thought is the proportion of posts, of 50-cent posts about taunting of foreign countries and argumentative praise or criticism, they thought these would be about 100%, but they're actually 0. So it's just really false that what these people are doing is arguing against the government. When they fabricate news, they fabricate fluff. They don't fabricate argument, they fabricate fluff. Right? And almost all of them actually, a very large fraction, 80%, are actually cheerleading. That's the fluff. So that's what we found in that one county. In the Weibo accounts in that one county, even outside of those 43,000, right? We went back to the Weibo accounts. We went out to the web to find where they were, and we pulled out all the posts from those accounts, and there's 167,000 of those. And these now look like this. There's still basically 0 of these. There's a little less cheerleading, but still way more than any other category. And there's a few more in these categories. We then took the data and partitioned them into two categories in order to make it easy for us to extrapolate. Those are the red ones. Fortunately, the pair of red ones in each category are about the same, so that means we can use just one of them to extrapolate to the rest of China. And the patterns are pretty much the same as the rest. Then we went within the county to all posts that are 50-cent posts, not just the ones that were leaked. And again, the pattern's similar. And finally, there needs to be a drum roll at this point, by the way. But nobody has drums, right? Maybe our translator has drums. So the last one is prediction across all of China outside this one county. And as you can see, there it is, my little dot. As you can see, the cheerleading it's still at 65% or something like that. So what this shows is, at least for our extrapolation, almost everything that these people are doing is just posting, cheerleading, positivity, fluff. Okay, so let me tell you how big it is, and then I'll validate what it is we did. So how big is it? How many of these posts are they putting up on the web? Are they making up? Are they fabricating? So we first figured out the total number of social media posts in all of China, all social media posts, and there's about, in 2013, there were about 80 billion a year. The number of 50-cent posts in this one county that we figured out was about 154,000. The number of 50-cent posts in the province in which the county falls is about 10 million. The number of 50-cent posts now across all of China, this is where the drum roll comes in again, is 448 million fabricated posts that someone writes by hand and posts on the web in the name of ordinary people. Imagine running this operation yourself, right? And getting people to write 448 million of these things by hand. This is an extraordinary government operation. It's probably almost as big as what the candidates were doing in the last United States presidential election. If you don't laugh at that, I'm in big trouble. Okay. About half of these 448 million posts were on government websites, government social media websites commenting on individual offices. And it's a noticeable proportion of all of them. About half of them are on commercial websites, the Chinese equivalent of Facebook and Twitter and many others. It's about one out of every 178th post. Now, if it were actually every 178th post, even though it's 448 million, it would be like shouting into the wind. No one would hear. So what is it that they actually do? Let's take a closer look at when these are posted. So here's a timeline of the 2 years that we studied, 2013 and 2014. And the vertical axis is a count of posts. And on most days, as you can see, there are no 50-cent posts at all. But on some days, occasionally, there's huge bursts of thousands and thousands of 50-cent posts. Remember, this vertical axis, the numbers here are just this one county out of 3,000 counties. There's huge bursts at the time that they need it. So when there's a protest, one of the things they'll do is censor. That's what our previous paper showed. And another thing that they will do that this paper shows is they fire this giant cannon of dilutive posts that distract from the real things that are going on. So they're coordinated bursts of posts, many for events with collective action potential or actual collective action. It's a clear measure of what the government intends. Okay, so that's what we found. That's what we found. How do we know that what we found is right? So how do you validate that people are fabricating social media posts, hiding them, and posting them in the name of other people? So we thought, let's ask them, okay? It's a little outrageous, but let's just try it, okay? How do you ask them? First of all, these are not your optimal survey respondents, right? Their job is to intentionally mislead. And their job is to intentionally mislead about the subject of our survey. They take orders from an uncompromising government. Their employer is that government. They have their job at stake, and potentially a lot more than their job. This is not the research you want to be doing. You know? So we designed a survey. Here's the survey. We first took a random sample of 50-cent accounts that we predicted were making things up. Okay? So our methods predicted them. So we took a random sample of them. We now had people, or at least accounts that represented people. There's an extensive literature in the social sciences about how to ask sensitive survey questions, how to interview people about private sexual behavior. Or some of this has been used even in Mexico years ago to figure out whether people would criticize the government. Some kinds of things they do are list experiments where they say, do you like tomatoes? Do you like enchiladas? Do you like tall people? And then they ask another group the same questions, and they also say, do you like the government? Right? And then they ask the question. They don't ask, do you like each one? They just say, how many of those do you like? Right? And you say, well, I don't like tomatoes. I don't like the government. That's two. Right? And then you just take the difference between the treated and the control group. It's very clever. But even so, the question wording itself, you have to make sure that you're not threatening, that people understand you, that we're able to elicit the information we want. So there's an extensive literature on how to do this. And we followed that as close as we could. But still, even so, we're asking people who have every incentive to lie to us. Okay. So we also studied the local social media context. Okay, still. Okay. We did a double-blind survey. They didn't know who we were. We didn't know who they were. Okay, so that helps, because in a double-blind context, people are more likely to be honest. Okay. We had a specially designed, highly pre-tested survey question. Here's the question, the actual question is in Chinese, which isn't going to help most people here, and I'm also not going to show you the exact question because we don't want anybody to track down who participated in our survey. So here's an approximation to what we asked, translated into English. I saw your comment on the web. It's really inspiring. So to explain that the social situation is, it's not a bad thing. I want to ask, do you have any public opinion guidance management or online commenting experience? So in the term of art in Chinese, public opinion guidance are all the things the Chinese government does to influence its public opinion. They do censorship, that's public opinion guidance. They fabricate posts, that's public opinion guidance. Remember, the Chinese government is not embarrassed about what they do. So they don't always make it public, but they're not embarrassed about it. And they have a term for it. It's called public opinion guidance. So we asked that question. All right. So, and then I'm going to show you the results. But we also need to validate this method of validation. How do you know that this method of validation is a good method of validating the thing that we're trying to validate? So we asked the same question of a sample of people we knew for sure should say yes because they were 50-cent party members. And then we asked the same question of people who we knew were almost for sure were not 50-cent party members. And we better get the same results for the first and not for the second, or at least close. Okay, so let me show you the results. We start off with people predicted to be 50-cent workers all across China. What percent agreed that they were fabricating posts? And it turns out 59% of them, when we asked them, agreed that they were fabricating posts. So that's pretty good by itself, because even if 40% were lying to us, 60% said that they were fabricating posts. But then to validate the validation, we have the known 50-cent people in this one county, in the Zhanggang archive. And we asked them the same question, right? So how many of them would tell us the truth? Okay? Turns out 57%, which is almost the same number as 59. We thought, yes. Well, how about the people who are known not to be 50 cent, or nearly known not to be 50 cent parties, based on a random sample of accounts, and it was only 19%. Okay. The difference between the first two is not different statistically. The difference between the first and the third is different. So that's a pretty good confirmation, and confirmation of the confirmation. Okay, I'll tell you one more story. We were nearly finished with this paper. We had written a draft of the paper. We were sharing it by email privately with colleagues, right? Like I would send a copy to you and ask, could you send me comments? And not publish them on the web, but send me comments. We'd sent them to a small number of people, and all of a sudden, I got an email from a reporter from a major outlet who said, I saw your paper. I'm going to write an article about it. Can you please answer some questions? And I said, well, wait a minute. Our paper hasn't been published. We haven't even submitted it for publication. We haven't posted it on our website. We haven't even finished it. Could you please wait? And he said, no. He said, I have competitors. They're going to scoop me. This is too interesting a story. I'm going to write this article. Will you please answer my questions? Okay, so Jen and Molly and I thought, should we have an argument in the context of a paper about the Chinese government fabricating news with a reporter about freedom of the press? So I said, fine, okay. We posted the unfinished paper, nearly finished to be fair, on my website. I answered his questions, and he published an article about our work. He was right. He had a lot of people on his heels. He published the article at 3 o'clock in the morning, Boston time, and by 6 o'clock in the morning, it was in every major outlet. And in the next 48 hours, according to Google News, there were 5,000 articles worldwide about our little preprint. 5,000 newspaper articles, right? Not what we intended. Okay. Wow. In fact, there were so many articles that the Chinese government actually responded to this giant wave of discussion about our article. And they responded to our article. So there's a newspaper in China called the Global Times. It's a nationalist, that is pro-China newspaper. It's published in English and Chinese. It is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, that's CCP. So it is basically the government or something close to the government. They published an editorial solely about our paper. Like, attention from the Chinese government we were not looking for, believe me. And a month ago, by the way, I presented this paper in Beijing. So and I'm here. So this article, first of all, this editorial, was published only in Chinese, even though the Global Times is typically published in English and Chinese. They didn't publish it in English, they only published it in Chinese. That, very interestingly, was consistent with the theory we explained in our paper. Because in our paper we explained that the Chinese government is mostly interested in their people. They don't care about Western military powers. No one's going to be invading China. They have nuclear weapons and huge armies. No one's going to do that. The only thing that's going to get them thrown out of power is their own people rising up. They need to pay attention to their own people. So this article, published in Chinese and not in English, they were not speaking to the 5,000 newspaper articles or to Gary, Jen, and Molly. They were speaking to their own people to explain to them why they were doing this. Okay. So in the course of writing this editorial, they admitted, essentially for the first time, to the existence of the 50 Cent Party. We thought, that's good. In fact, the beginning of the editorial, the first paragraph of the editorial, is basically an abstract of our paper, a fairly accurate summary of what we argued and what we found. By a government. Willie mentioned this paper that I wrote called Replication, where we encourage researchers to make data available so that other researchers can replicate their work. I challenge you to try to replicate this part of this work. Actually, don't try. In the course of writing this editorial, they confirmed the veracity of our data source, of the leaked archive. They summarized our results. They took no issue with any of our conclusions. Okay? Right? They acknowledged that the purpose of public opinion guidance, which remember they're not embarrassed about, is to stop the spread of what they call grassroots social issues with collective action potential, which is exactly what we argued. So this was roughly equivalent to posing a survey question to the government. You know how social scientists often interview members of governments? You know, like we'll get some time with a legislator or a former president and we'll interview them, right? Well, we got to interview the entire government, right? It was almost like the government, we asked the government of Mexico, or in this case, China, of course, a question. And the question was, do you agree with our results? And the government, as an official act of government, effectively said, well, yeah, we agree. So you might ask, why in the world did they do this? So we thought, this is very meta. Do you know that phrase? This is very meta, right? Because we did a study. Then we validated the study. Then we validated the validation of the study. Then there was articles written about our study and the validation of our study. And then there was an editorial in China about the validation of the validation of the validation of the study. And now I'm going to talk about why they wrote the editorial about the... So the editorial said, Chinese society is generally in agreement regarding the necessity of public opinion guidance. And we thought, well, that's a testable hypothesis. They're making a claim. We can test that. And so we did it in two ways. First is an obvious way, and then the real test. The obvious way is we went to the website of the Global Times. The Global Times is a nationalist website, like pro-China, right? You would expect comments there to be completely consistent with what they want. And we found that 82%, sure enough, agreed that public opinion guidance is necessary. But then the real test. Supportive posts on the more representative Weibo, that is on basically the equivalent of Twitter. And we found 30% of the people agreeing agreeing that public opinion guidance is important. So the results indicate that, first of all, the figures are accurate because they don't make up these posts. We know because of our research, right? They don't post, the 50-cent posts are not about the subject we're studying. They don't censor things about the subject we're studying. But then, that 30% indicates the regime has a problem. They have a real problem. Their people do not support them. And the ideology of the Chinese regime is that the people and the government are the same thing. Right? The research that would try to figure out whether there's an agreement between two things wouldn't even make sense in that context, because they think they're the same. But in fact, they have a real problem. So just to conclude, for China, theoretical implications are they do not engage on controversial issues. They don't censor criticism. They don't argue against criticism with 50-cent posts. All they do is they try to stop collective action. They respond to grievances. They actually respond in local towns and cities to try to satisfy people, to prevent collective action from coming to in the beginning. It's a representative, responsive kind of thing for a government to do. Otherwise, they're going to be in big trouble. They censor discussion of real-world collective action immediately, like a hair-on-fire event. Like if your hair is on fire, you respond very fast. And then they distract with giant cannon bursts of cheerleading and positive valence discussions. More generally, for authoritarian regimes, scholars had thought that autocrats wanted to reduce knowledge of grievances. That is, if there's a complaint, the autocrat would want nobody to know about it, because then that would increase the cost of coordination among people where they may then rise up. That was the view. We find that China seems to have two versions of this common knowledge. One is about grievances, which they allow, right? Like there were a bunch of dictators why not allow grievances? Why not allow people to talk about things that they don't like? Everybody knows there's things that people don't like. So it's no problem, it's already well known. What they don't allow is any discussion of collective action. And they take emergency action to try to stop it. In addition, arguments never end arguments, but distraction does. If you don't remember the context of the talk, I recommend that you remember this at home. And for future research, when studied at scale, Chinese government information controls and the information controls in governments around the world leave big footprints, like that elephant. And I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you. Thank you so much. With my friend in the box there, I'm happy to take questions in English, Spanish, Chinese. You're okay with that, right?
Thank you very much, Gary, for this great conference. What I suggest is that we are going to take questions in English, and we're also going to take questions in Spanish. So if you have, si tienen preguntas en español, por favor, las pueden escribir. Las podemos ir recogiendo y yo luego las voy a traducir para que Gary pueda responderles a las preguntas en español. Tenemos una media hora. We have 30 minutes to debate. And just to launch the debate quickly, we may go back to the conclusions, because this is what I wanted to comment. I mean, we could discuss the methodological framing of and how they did that. But I think it's very complicated. So we might also look at this in comparative perspective, since we're in Mexico. And I mean, Gary won't like the comparison, but this made me think some sort of do you remember manufacturing consent? Manufacturing consent of Chomsky. Noam Chomsky has a proposal in the 80s. And I think this makes a lot of sense in comparative perspective. There are theoretical implications that we may push much further, because this is actually what authoritarianism is about. Why are authoritarian regimes stable, and how do they create legitimacy? And we need to much better understand this. And when we think of China, I thought China was a totalitarian state, but it looks like more like an authoritarian regime. And what I wonder is if it doesn't look also, if it doesn't work in democratic regimes. Because I was wondering if in the UK, for instance, or in France, or in the USA, we do not see very similar mechanisms at work of getting ice cream and talking about weather and so how do you, I mean, we need to better understand how social media are working nowadays. In Mexico, it is clear that everybody is complaining about everything, but there is no collective action. So it's amazing how there is a constant catharsis in social media about criticizing the government in a very tough way, but I remember the last time there was a protest to ask President Peña Nieto to resign. So when I looked at the social media, I saw, wow, the government is going to collapse, you know. Then I went to the manifestation that they were, and not only were people late, which may happen, there were 1,000 people there turning out to the protest. But on social media, you had the impression that the country was collapsing. My question for you is, how does this work in the US? Does it make sense to compare the US, Trump's US, the fake news US? How does that fit together? And also, let's think about Mexico and other countries.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the things that we saw in China, I mean, China's great from the point of view of research because the government's not embarrassed about it. We can see it. You know, they don't always answer questions like they did, but in some sense it may illuminate what goes on a little below the radar in other countries. But I think the way to look at it is that it's not that the government, the Chinese government, the Mexican government, the American government, is making decisions about what's to go on and that's it. So the people also respond. Really, I think we have to think of this as an ongoing battle between the rulers and the ruled. And in China, for example, during the protests in Hong Kong, the Chinese government got information from the cell towers in Hong Kong about where individuals were, and they were tracking them. The people then realized that the Chinese government had that information. So they developed an app on their cell phones. It was called FireChat. And what FireChat did is it communicated from person to person about the protests or anything else without going through the cell towers. Right? In fact, it would go from person to person to person to find the person you're trying to talk to without going through the cell towers. Right? So it evaded the Chinese government looking at them. And then the Chinese government saw that and they said, oh, so they came up with a version of FireChat that looked exactly like the original FireChat, and they spread it around to the population, except it did one extra thing. It sent information back home. It told them where they were. Right? And so this is, I think, an ongoing battle between the rulers and the ruled in every place. And it happens here too. So, I mean, it happens everywhere else too.
Okay, let's take some questions. Maybe someone can help me with a microphone.
So a great talk and a great project and very beautifully presented. In fact, congratulations, everybody will really have enjoyed it. I think there was a slight suggestion in the way you presented it that it was surprising to you that you got such good confirmation from this repressive authoritarian regime in China. I'm not quite so surprised as perhaps it sounded as though you were. And let me suggest two hypotheses and see what you think. First of all, so why would the people who are doing the information management, when asked by you, 59% of them say, yes, we did it. Well, actually, they didn't know who you were, and you could easily have been somebody in the Central Committee looking for the best people to do, most enthusiastic, most efficient in doing it, with the possibility that they get promotion out of it. So why wouldn't they, since they didn't know, why wouldn't they actually assume this would, and it was nicely, the question was put respectfully, they're doing a good job, why shouldn't they tell you yes? They may, even some of them have claimed to be doing it who weren't doing it because they'd like to be hired to do it, for example. So if there's a distortion, it might not be that they were lying to conceal, it might be... and the other one is, why would the government press, or the Global Times, be so quick and so open in confirming what you're saying? Well, I'm imagining, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm imagining the people in charge of this department in the Chinese government, who of course have to struggle with other departments for a budget, and are we doing a good job, and is it effective, and so on. Here's a wonderful piece of Harvard at its best, is saying you're doing a great job. So why wouldn't you say, yes, we confirm it all. And by the way, your presentation will be used in our next budget request.
So I think these are great points. The first one, in some sense, I'll take as a compliment because we intended for the people we were asking to feel that way, to feel not insulted and to feel, we don't know who those people are, but we're proud of it. So I'm totally with you. We were very careful about the incentives and the position that they were in. The second one, which was the Chinese government, of course, we didn't design that. It just sort of happened, so who knows. I think your point is absolutely plausible. The first paper we wrote on this subject, when we had a lot less a lot less experience with the Chinese government. We later learned that the following thing happened, which is completely consistent with your view. So the first paper showed that the Chinese government, at a massive scale, is censoring posts, not about grievances, not about criticism, but about collective action. That is what they're doing, and it was surprising to lots of people. Although everybody after the fact says, "Oh yeah, it makes sense," right? Well, it turns out we discovered that there was a meeting of the Chinese propaganda department, not of this county, but of the country. And the second in command of the whole country showed up with a rolled-up version of our paper with his collective troops, and he said, "Why can't you do work like this?" He took it as an evaluation of their people, in which he came out well. So maybe that's right.
Great. Les recuerdo que tomamos también preguntas en español escritas y luego las vamos a ir recogiendo. También las podemos traducir si son preguntas específicas. Aquí hay alguien, ¿no?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Gary King. I have some questions for you. The first one, are you planning to study North Korea as well? and if you have any comparison between China and North Korea about their openness on social media. And, well, this is my first question. The second one is, what was your goal with this study? Did you learn something about authoritarian strategies, something new, or did you just confirm your previous hypothesis about government action or respond to criticism? No? And the third comment that I have is about a comparison between your results in China and what is going on in Mexico. Because here in our country, of course there is much freedom of speech in social media and in normal media, but we also experience this kind of strategies from the government to distract public opinion. You know? We even have, there was a famous film, a Mexican film called The Perfect Dictatorship. And in that film, they recall a government strategy called the Chinese box, which means that the government, when there is something that is hurting the Mexican government, the media immediately put another issue as the most important in the agenda. So in this way, that news which hurted the government is left behind, and in the end, nobody remembers that which hurted our government. So it seems that this strategy does not only apply in authoritarian regimes, but also in some semi-authoritarian or countries which more or less have governments who actually trying to become authoritarian. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. So North Korea has a much simpler job, a simpler set of rules about censoring. What they do is they censor all social media posts. they have essentially no social media posts. So that's a different strategy, but it is nevertheless a strategy. So let me connect that with your other questions, because I think they're very closely related. So the way that we came to think about this, remember the goal of this paper had nothing to do even with China, much less authoritarian regimes. But what we came to learn, the way we came to think about this is in similar ways to the way you're asking the question. It's not really about authoritarian regimes. It's about people in power and what it is that they want, and then they pass policies, promulgate policies that help them achieve what they want. So what is it that they want? What they want, at first, is to stay in office. If they don't want that, they don't get to have anything else. So it's not a cynical comment that Mexican legislators, American legislators, the Chinese government, they want to stay in office. right? So that's like a rational choice kind of assumption, but it's actually got to be true. If it's not true, they're going to lose their job eventually, right? So they have to pay some attention to that. So what the Chinese government is doing is totally consistent with them staying in office. So now let's think about democratic governments or partially democratic governments or whatever, however you want to describe them. You know, members of the United States Congress, they'd like to be reelected. How do you do that? Well, people are going to object to what you're saying. What you want is no collective action, right? If individuals in their homes don't like you, well, that's not good. You'd rather them like you. But if individuals in their home don't like you and get together in a big protest and everybody else gets to know about it, and that motivates someone else to run against you, and that motivates people to spend money to help defeat you, that's a big problem. So that means that in democratic countries, they also need to pay attention to collective action more than criticism. And after all, there's never been a democratically elected politician that hasn't been criticized. Right? I mean, pretty much everywhere you have to be criticized. That's what democracy is, right? So you can't stop it, but you can do things to stop collective action. Let me go one more step beyond your question. Suppose you're running a company, right? A private company, and someone doesn't like your product. Okay? So if they don't like your product and they're sitting in their home and they would never want to buy your product, or they bought it once and they hate it, and that's all that happens, you know, you lost a customer. Big deal. There's a lot of other customers. But if they start posting on social media and they convince all the other people that bought your product, considered buying your product, or who know other people who might want to buy your product, to protest about it, then there could be a boycott of your product. People all of a sudden who had no opinion about your product would boycott it. That would influence other people. They also have to stop collective action. So their goal is not to stay in office, it's to make money, that's what they're defined. But they have a very similar profile of what they need. Let me tell one other story that you sparked in my mind, but it's a little different than your question. So when we did our censorship study, we learned that the Chinese government actually censors 2 other small categories that are different than what I described. And they show the sort of human nature of things. So one is pornography. So the Chinese government will censor pornography. You know, no surprise, every government in the world censors some definition of pornography, right? In the United States, you know, don't post child pornography, they'll come get you, they'll pick you up, you know. I mean, right, so that's the first thing. Humans are obsessed with sex, right? I didn't teach you that, okay? And that affects every government in the world. Right? The second thing that we discovered is that you can criticize every leader in China just as criticism, as long as it's not collective action, and you won't be censored, except for one. If you criticize the people who run the censorship office, they will stop you. They will censor you. You can criticize Xi Jinping, the president of China. You will not be censored. But if you censor the guy who runs the censorship office, they will censor you. I think we discovered something that was not Chinese policy, but it was just human nature, right? If we were running censorship about things written about us, you know, we might like to prune a few comments that were made about us, right? So I think there's like all these people, authoritarians, democratic leaders, people who run companies, they're all just humans, right? And they all have very similar profiles for things that they want. Thanks.
Buenos días. Me fascinó, respeto mucho su trabajo, me gustó mucho la forma.
My friend's translating into Chinese.
Buenos días.
Yes, they're translating into Chinese for me.
Buenos días, muchas gracias. Me gustó mucho la presentación de su trabajo, me gustó la forma como se mueve al estar presentando sus resultados. Sin embargo, tengo un shock en la cabeza por tanta información, pero quisiera plantearle algunos comentarios y 2 preguntas. ¿Por qué estudiar China? ¿Por qué un profesor tan prestigioso como Gary King estudia China? ¿Qué implica para una institución en la que él pertenece estudiar China? ¿Qué implica? O si implica algo para los Estados Unidos estudiar China. La siguiente tiene que ver, todos los gobiernos nos mienten, desde luego. En México sabemos que tantos periodistas muertos son para censurar el desarrollo de una cultura política, el desarrollo del conocimiento de la gestión del gobierno, etc. Y mi tercer asunto va en el sentido de qué forma impacta a la sociedad china estos resultados que ha estado usted presentando. ¿Ha tenido algún efecto esta información en estas personas de China? Muchas gracias.
Thanks so much. There has been reaction to our paper in China. There's been, each of the papers we've written have been translated into Chinese, not by us, we didn't arrange it or anything, but just by the Chinese academics, and they I guess bootlegged copies of our papers were just made public and discussed quite widely, actually. So that was interesting, and we followed some of that discussion, and we even downloaded it and analyzed it, so it helped us understand what people think about certain issues. Why study China? Well, it's an extreme. It's a fascinating country. So we should study it because it's a fascinating country. It is a country with tremendous state capacity. So they have the ability to read all social media posts. Wow! Can you imagine doing that? So the Russian government, for example, let's compare Russia and China. That's not exactly your question, but it is related to your question. Because they operate differently. We're worried about what they're doing in other countries, but what are they doing in their own country? So China has this tremendous state capacity. They write 450 million social media posts a year. They read 80 billion social media posts and decide which ones to censor. What does Russia do? They censor too, but they're supposed to be a democracy. They're embarrassed about censorship, so they don't make it public. They don't admit to it publicly. So how does it work? Well, they don't have thousands and thousands or hundreds of thousands of workers that do these things. They just sort of hire folks, and they go and have bot attacks. Like we looked a little in Russia, and we'd see like a bot attack where the bot says the leader of the opposition is an idiot. That's the name of that's what the post says. And then they would send 50,000 identically worded posts. 50,000 of them out, right? That's sort of ham-handed, not very good, not very professional. But they do this kind of thing. Of course, they'll also send people out to beat people up. So it's much more Wild Westish. It's much more chaotic. I think, and then if you look at like Iran has even more state capacity in a certain sense. It's much closer to the totalitarian end of the continuum that Willie was talking about. There, I don't know what the rules are. We haven't studied it exactly, but they can certainly stop criticism of any kind, right? And so imagine now you're the leader of one of these countries. I don't want to describe you as an autocrat or a democratically elected leader or whatever it is, because from this perspective, they all have some similarities. So now you're the leader of one of these countries. How do you want to implement your method of information control or public opinion guidance or whatever it is you want to call it? You have no choice but to do it to some degree, because you have to stay in power, and not doing it means you're also doing it. So it's really quite an amazing question. No matter how liberal a Democrat you want to be, you're still going to do some of it. So what is it that you would do? Right? Very difficult question.
We still have time for one last question.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your fascinating talk. I'm really surprised. And I know that it's much more sexy to talk about China, but I would like to ask you two methodological questions. I mean, the first one is that I found very challenging the way you move from an empirical fact, something that at the beginning started to be like censorship and then turned to be like a strategy of destruction, and especially, the way you jump from this to a research question. And you mentioned that you have a kind of a strategy or a technique, and you do it through making mistakes. Well, I mean, starting with an argument, and then, a kind of a hypothesis, and then you, in a sense, look for evidence, and you find that it's wrong. So, I mean, most of us, when we don't have the results we expect, we just, drop the research or depress and go to the bar and have some drinks and forget about the research because we don't find nothing. So, I mean, talk about please this technique. I mean, how do you do this? I mean, how to learn from our errors, from our mistakes. And the second question is about validation. I mean, validation, the methodological validation, context validation, and so how many validations validate your data and your findings? Imagine one day, just for one day, that the Chinese government said, oh no, validate. Is your survey enough to say, okay, my findings are validated? Oh.
So those are great questions. Thank you. So I tell students, and I guess we'll have a conversation at 5 o'clock or so this evening, right? Is that right? What time is it? Yeah, or 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock, right? No, 15 o'clock. Whatever. Anyway, I find that students are asked, spend most of their academic careers, from nursery school, kindergarten, all the way up through graduate school, where all the assignments fall into the same category. They're all asked a specific question that is an immutable, unchangeable, fixed question, and then they have to answer it as best as they can. And then when they get to the point of being asked to write a research paper, they ask the question stays fixed, and they do the best they can to answer the question. And they're great students, so they do the best they can. And that is a huge mistake. That's a huge mistake. You find the question that you can answer. So if I did that, I would be giving a talk today, a technical talk, about methods of automated text analysis in English. Right? I mean, we found something much more interesting, and we went in a different direction. So I'm changing my course, actually, that I teach to include this piece. And I call it, to me, what's the big idea? Right? Because that's really the question when you do research. And it's to look for a question that you can answer. That's what we always do in research. We look for a question where we can make a contribution. And that question is not always the one that you start out with, right? It's a little crazy to ask for a research proposal from us, right? Because what's a research proposal? That's us trying to convince a funder that we're going to find something surprising if we can collect the data. Well, how are we supposed to know it's surprising? How are we supposed to convince them that it's going to be surprising? We're not even surprised yet. We don't have any information. We don't have any evidence. We don't know whether it's true, right? So I love the question, because I think this is actually the point of most research, which is go find the thing that you're doing. And if you're planning to interview Indian legislators, and on your way there you trip over and discover an archive about something interesting that's going on in Mexico City, write about that. Totally agree. And your second question, there's of course no end to validation. We never really know for sure. So what I always explain is, it's our job to make ourselves vulnerable to being proven wrong in as many ways as possible, as many diverse ways as possible. And I think, the more the better. And hopefully, of course, we wouldn't actually be wrong, but our procedures have to make ourselves vulnerable to being proven wrong. So I just perhaps cleverly re-asked your question without answering it. So, thank you very much.
We're running out of time, unfortunately, but there was another interesting question we might address quickly, which was, what other types of strategies that you derive from all the data, quantitative and qualitative? What other type of strategies, what typology of strategies of communication may we think of in comparative perspective if we want to work in Mexico or in the US or in the UK?
So I think of, in my view, all research, 100% of research is qualitative, and some research is also quantitative, right? There's qualitative research in everything we do. And purely quantitative research is an Excel spreadsheet with no column or row labels, right? It doesn't make any sense at all, right? So you always have to have both. So that's the first sort of answer. Second answer is that qualitative approaches and quantitative approaches, we always have that's our own personal war, right? We always have this war between the quantitative people and the qualitative people. If you don't go like this, you don't, I know they're not translating. But I think actually this war is going away. And the reason why is because we're becoming adults. we realize that we need both when both are appropriate. And it is the case that qualitative sources of information, like in this case, unstructured text, there's too much of it to read in qualitative ways. If we could read it rather than analyze it statistically, we would. But the reason we didn't is because we're wholly inadequate to the task. Because we're human, right? We're not good at it, right? We can't read that many. So we need some help. And similarly, other sources of qualitative information are things like video and audio and thousands of pages of field notes, none of which we can really take and completely consume ourselves. We could use some help from the quantitative researchers. And the quantitative researchers certainly need a lot of help from the qualitative researchers. So the combination of the two is, I think, where we're ending up.
Thank you very much. Great answer. So, as Gary pointed out, there will be a face-to-face session this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Como Gary lo mencionó, hay una sesión de face-to-face a las 3 de la tarde en punto en el aula 18, que queda aquí muy cerca, a la par, donde podemos seguir dialogando. So we keep on this dialogue with Gary. So we wanted really to thank him very much to have made time in this agenda to be here, and we would like to give him, well, en español, I have to, un reconocimiento. We would like to recognize that you came, and we would like to give you recognition of AMECIP, which Jesus Cantú will help us to do.
Well, Gary, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to give you this AMECIP medal that implies also honorific lifelong membership of AMECIP. So we hope to see you here in the next Congress among us. Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to be here.
It's a great honor.
No, it's a great honor for us to have you with us, and it was an extraordinary talk at conference. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so for the pictures, we invite you to the